Good morning and welcome to Service Objects TCPA webinar about leveraging data quality to improve TCPA compliance. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. We're just going to give everyone a few minutes to get settled and get set up. Look forward to telling you a little bit about TCPA compliance and how Service Objects can help you guys. Give everyone a few more minutes here. I see people trying to log in right now. You can make faces at people.
I guess so.
Great. I think we're ready to start. As everyone's logged in and ready to go. Good morning, and I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us. My name is Rob Mansard. This is Jeff Groh, our CEO and founder of Service Objects. Jeff will be sharing his insights and expertise in the about the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA, and what we think are the 3 C's for compliance with the TCPA, which are consent, check, and compare. And more importantly, how you can improve your compliance through data quality. And that's largely what we'll be talking about today. As you may be aware, the Act was has introduced a number of regulations and restrictions for outbound calling and texting prospects. Companies are responsible for maintaining ongoing compliance and/or risk expensive fines from the FCC. You can no longer simply capture consent and start calling. The penalties are just too great. As part of our presentation, we will discuss how data quality tools like Service Objects Web Services can provide a solution for examining critical data points that are required to maintain TCPA compliance. We have about 20 slides. It should take about 20-25 minutes. And at the end, we'll do our best to answer questions. But if you have any in the moment, please feel free to send them in to us to the question bar. And so we'll get started. Now, but before we get started, I have the obligatory disclaimer. This information is provided for information purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal advice. If you have questions about recent TCPA Omni declaratory ruling, you should check with your own legal and compliance departments. Now, with that said, we'll dive into some slides here, and we'll talk about what to expect today. So number one, we'll talk about the changing landscape with the consumer communications. And then after that, we'll touch on the basics of the TCPA Act. We won't go into the deep legal details. That's for people with law degrees to do. And then we'll talk about the penalties for violating the TCPA. We'll talk about our 3 C's for compliance. We'll use Jeff will go through some real-world examples that I think are pretty interesting and pretty simple in their solutions. And then we'll wrap up with a review, and finally we'll have a little bit of question and answers at the end. And with that said, I'll turn it over to Mr. Groh here, and we'll talk about TCPA.
Thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the nice intro. There's a famous TED Talk out there right now that says you should never start a presentation with a chart. So what do I do here is I started my presentation with a chart. This is actually a chart of households in the United States that have switched to wireless only communications. So they dumped their landline, now they're mobile only. They no longer have that landline, they're no longer in directory assistance. And there was a tipping point recently, or early 2015, that tipping point occurred where we had more homes in the United States that were mobile only that were landline only. I'm sure no one is surprised by that. That's not any news here. But this tipping point required a lot of new legislation for consumer privacy or privacy governance. Lawmakers have chosen to address this issue or this tipping point by adding on and updating and building onto the existing Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA. TCPA was originally passed by George Herbert Walker Bush, GW, originally passed in 1991. It was designed to safeguard consumer privacy, and it set the foundation for what we all know as the National Do Not Call Registry. It has undergone continuous modification, and most recently has really been modified to address the rise in cell phones and protect consumer privacy on the cell phones. In 2013, some of the most recent legislation was passed into law, and it provided for larger fines for unwanted calls. In that, the FCC can fine up to $16,000 per call or per violation, and consumers can sue for $1,500 per call or per violation. In 2015, late 2015, the FCC provided clarification on what is meant as consent. And also in late 2015, they provided clarification on the detection and the assignment of reassigned numbers. How they wanted to make sure that people were looking at reassigned numbers and provided some clarity on that. TCPA gets a lot of press, gets a lot of bad press recently. There's a lot of legislation, a lot of litigation going on about it now. We've been seeing it's a big news item. We see it all the time. Every month you see in the news multi-million-dollar class action suits are being filed, being settled. In fact, I just learned about a new case where Facebook is being sued because they sent texts to phone numbers that have been reassigned. They're litigating that. Recently, Dish Network is litigating a lawsuit that goes back to 2011, where they knowingly placed millions of calls, and is looking at $23 billion in fine. Capital One recently settled for $75 million. Chase Bank has paid $3.75 million to settle TCPA suits. Papa John's has paid $16 million to end a TCPA settlement. Caribbean Cruise Lines, $76 million. Wells Fargo, $30 million. Multi-million-dollar suits have been settled recently for Rite Aid, CVS, GoDaddy, Best Buy, Guess Clothing, and the list doesn't stop there. In 2015, there were 3,867 or 3,687 TCPA suits filed.
My typo. Sorry.
Yeah, no, my bad. And in 2016, there were 4,860 lawsuits filed. That's roughly about 31% increase in these lawsuits. If you look at the next chart, we plotted the number of lawsuits over time. TCPA has been around since 1991. Prior to 2010, the number of lawsuits or awards were not significant. In 2010, there were 500 lawsuits. In 2013, the FCC changed TCPA to allow for larger damages, up to $16,000 per call. Plaintiff attorneys took notice and turned up the heat on businesses that were making outbound calls or outbound texts as part of their go-to-market strategy. And as a result, filings have been up filings over the last 6 years have gone up tenfold. As I mentioned, in 2016, we're up to almost 5,000 filings. It's not really in the scope of this presentation to do a deep dive on the law, but our customers have worked with us to use some of our services, and we've come up with maybe 6 tips that we like to promote to help them minimize their TCPA liability. The tip number 1 is very basic. It's obtain prospect consent. If you are collecting your prospects online or have a storefront application, it's very important to have clear TCPA compliant disclosure language on your online forms or in your customer application. Even if that customer has contacted you first, the prospect initiated through a call or a text, this does not provide automatic consent. Even if you have a pre-existing business relationship with that customer, that also does not provide consent for communication. So you really need to look closely at, do you have consent to contact these people on their mobile device, on their landline, or send them a text automatically. For online prospects, those that you might be getting through a web registration form, it's important that you validate the incoming information to determine the truthfulness, the genuineness of contact information. Courts have ruled that phone number only registrations do not constitute consent. They're looking for other items such as time of day, which web page did they register on, did they provide a name, did they provide an address, did they provide additional information. So phone number alone does not provide consent. There are some additional elements there. It's also important, item number 3 is that marketers utilize phone enhancement services to tell in real time if a line type is a landline, VoIP, or wireless, if the phone type is business or residential, to determine the current carrier and to determine, if possible, the line owner information. And step number 4, it's really critical, or tip number 4, it's very critical for companies to store proof of consent in a database, in a long-term database, and store it for at least 5 years. Get the data registration, the time of registration, the device IP address, the geolocation information, the browser type, and any other PII. Store that for 5 years in your CRM system, and also store that in a secondary system, just for compliance, such as SQL or Splunk or Graylog. This is very critical information that will help reduce your liability that you'll want to keep around. Step number 5 is check the phone number reassignment prior to every call or every text. Before making any outbound call or any outbound text, run a quick test to determine if the phone number has been ported or reassigned. The case that we were talking about earlier with Facebook is that they're sending text messages out to phone numbers that have been reassigned, and they're getting in a lot of heat for it, and it's kind of costing them a lot of money. We'll talk more about that in a second. Number 6, maintain a company-wide, centralized, do not call list of phone numbers that can easily be updated when consent is revoked or a line reassignment has occurred. This database will span all your applications, your CRM system, your ERP system, maybe your marketing automation system. And any outbound texts and calls should be checked against this database prior to sending placing that call or placing a text message to them. So I want to dig a little deeper into those 6 steps. And getting prospect consent is very important. Marketers are required to get written prior consent for automated texts and text sent to cell phones. Marketers are also required to get written consent for any pre-recorded calls sent to residential landlines. So it's important to know if it's a landline or a cell number and continuously check. Electronic digital forms of signature are acceptable. So this means that you can get this consent through either email agreements or website forms, text messages, a telephone key press, or a voice recording. The FCC does require clear and conspicuous disclosure that the consumer may receive future calls. It also requires that marketers weed out the fake signups. And I want to show you what a fake sign-up looks like. My next example is, or I should say my first example of today, is a registration where someone clearly put in Mickey Mouse at 123 Main Street. Some lead generation systems or some lead generation campaigns yield almost 75% of information. In this example, the prospect entered a lot of bogus information. They entered Mickey Mouse, 123 Main Street. They put in 2 bogus phone numbers. They put in a bogus email address, and the IP address is kind of weird. When we run this through our prospect scoring system, it yields a score of a 0, which means it should be thrown out. The name is bogus, the address is bogus, the IP is a public proxy. And even though 2 phone numbers exist in this prospect lead, there's nothing genuine about it, and you should not contact it. You should not pipeline this opportunity. You should not call this. Not only for TCPA compliance issues, but also it's good business, as you don't want your sales team following up on leads that say Mickey Mouse. The next example I have is an opportunity from Mike Wilson at 921 Garcia Road, Santa Barbara, California. This lead is genuine, and this lead is accurate. The information provided here is real contact information from a real individual with a real email address. As a result, the prospect score comes up to a 95 out of 100. So we give this a thumbs up or a pass. This is valid and verified consent, And this opportunity should be pipelined and can be called because many of the data elements have very high integrity. Once you have consent, it's important to learn all you can about the phone numbers that were provided. If possible, you want to append the line type. Is it wireless? Is it landline? Is it Google Voice? Is it Skype? Is it disposable? You want to append the phone type. Is it business? Is it residential? Is it? You also want to append any prospect line owner information that you can get. The current carrier is also very important. Any insight you can get on the phone numbers provided, save that data to your database, and use this data to help look for reassignments in the future. In this case, we were able to take this phone number, 805-284-5103, and determine that that phone number indeed does belong to Mike Wilson at 921 Garcia Road, apartment 17, Santa Barbara, California. But more importantly, we're able to determine that this phone number is a current and active landline. It's also a residential listing. The phone number is currently assigned as of a few hours old to Frontier Communications, and it was last ported to Frontier on December 12th, 2013. Once you've got the consent, and once you have appended phone information, I need to stress that it's so important to archive all this into your CRM system and another repository. You can save the consent at the CRM level, at maybe the contact level, but there are great data repositories like Oracle SQL Server or Microsoft SQL Server or Splunk or Graylog, where you want to archive this data for long term. Having the details of consent is the key to disputing TCPA violations. Attorneys are recommending keeping this consent data and phone data for at least 5 years. So once again, and I know we've been over this, but it's important to record consent date, consent time, the name, the address, the phone number, any consent language that you have on your web page, or even better yet, a screenshot of the web page. Append any supplemental information you can that you knowingly have information here. The more information you can archive about that prospect and that phone number, the better. So now that you have consent and you've checked all the information about that user, now you're about to make a call. It's important to have a process or a procedure to do a quick check before each call or before each outbound communication. So here the marketing department is ready to make a phone call to 805-284-5103. That's the valid Mike Wilson lead we saw earlier. We do a real-time phone check. We check the current status of that phone number, and we want to check it, compare that to the original record to see if anything's changed. Because if we see a change, which we'll show you in a second, if we see a change, we're going to assume that that number has been reassigned. So in this case, we'll take that Mike Wilson real-time information and we'll go side by side with the information that we had earlier when he originally signed up. That'd be on the next slide. So on the left, I have Mike Wilson's originally signed up information. We knew originally on the left that Mike Wilson had this address in Santa Barbara, California, that he had a residential phone assigned to Frontier and was last ported on 2012. When we did the real-time dip, we were able to confirm that that line still belongs to Mike Wilson, that that line type is still a landline, that that carrier is still assigned to Frontier, and that that number had not been ported recently. In fact, the porting dates still are equal. So because here nothing changed, we compared each field individually, there are no clues for us of line reassignment. So this would be a pass. This would be a number that would be valid and okay to call because you have consent, because your real-time investigation prior to the call identified no reassignment. However, if a month goes by, or maybe 2 months go by, and you're looking to make a call again to that Mike Wilson, here the marketing department performs that quick pre-call check, and determines that that number no longer is assigned to Mike Wilson. It's assigned to Kathy Jones, and it's a VoIP number, and it belongs to Cox Communications, and it was recently ported. Here, the pre-check determines that it was Mike Wilson, now it's Kathy Jones. Let's compare these two side by side. We want to compare each field. Did the name change? And here the name did change. Did the landline change or the line type change? Yes, it went from landline to VoIP. Did the carrier change? Yes, the carrier changed from Frontier Communications to Cox Communications. And we also see that it was ported recently. So because we see that ported information, there are very strong clues here that this number has been reassigned. If it has been reassigned, you need to mark that in your centralized do not call list. You've lost the ability to call this person. Now, while TCPA does have some carve-outs for a grace period for ported information like this, and they do have kind of a one-time get-out-of-jail card should you accidentally make a call and the number has been reassigned. It's very important to trust the data that we're getting back and the data that's able to be provided. The FCC knows it exists. In their recent rulings, they have said that it's important that marketers use real-time line information to see if their reassignment has occurred. And even though there's some carve-outs, some protection, use the data, know it exists, know that that number has been reassigned. So I want to go back in summary here, look at the 6 tips to reduce a TCPA liability. If you collect contact information online, the storefront, have that clear TCPA disclosure language. There are a lot of good examples on that online. There's a couple law firms who specialize in that. If you contact us, we'll give you names to one of them. If you're getting your leads or your prospects online, make sure you're validating that incoming information. You don't want to pipeline Homer Simpson. You don't want to pipeline Mickey Mouse. You don't want to pipeline Indiana Jones. That's bogus contact information. That's not valid consent, and you can get yourself in trouble communicating with those leads. It's important that you store, let's see, you want to append the additional contact information. Once you have consent, look up the information you might have on a phone number, or look up the information you might get on that name, and append that record. And number 4 is store that information, archive that information to your database. Not only the consent details, but also the phone number information, landline, wireless, business, residential, current carrier. Number 5, prior to every contact, prior to every outbound text message, do a real-time instant check. They happen very, very quickly. You want to make sure that that number has not been reported. There are many good services out there that can provide clues and flags about potential phone number reassignments, and they're happening very frequently. Use a service that can provide an API, a real-time interface, to look for those clues for reassignment. And number 6, maintain that company-wide centralized do not call database. That database can be used when, across multiple systems, your CRM system, your call centers, your ERP systems, and your marketing automation systems. So if someone does opt out in one system, you have that centralized list across many systems.
Thanks, Jeff. This kind of sort of brings it all together for me, this 1-10-100 rule and how it applies to the TCPA specifically. It's one of my favorite rules in marketing. It basically says, for the cost of $1, you can validate a record at the time it's entered. If you don't do that, if you're not able to do that, it costs about $10 to clean it up later, whether in stream. And lastly, if you don't correct it, it has a meaningful impact, 100 times what it would have cost to correct it at the time of entry. And you can imagine that, now you have your sales reps calling numbers that don't exist. You can have marketing dollars spent against leads that don't exist. So, it's really important. I think this is really, the TCPA sort of highlights this in a different way, in that it's really about a penny to look up a phone number in real time. And at the far end of that spectrum, it's about a $16,000 fine, just the fine alone, if you don't look it up. So the rule applies, it's just a much more dramatic rule. So for a penny, I think it's a worthwhile investment to mitigate a $16,000 fine.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Robin. You know, it comes up time and time again. In fact, there are things, you know, such as brand fee, you know, legal fees to defend this, and also if you tarnish your brand because you're not following the rules, it can be quite painful.
Yeah, nobody wants a headline they're being sued by the FCC in the newspaper for brand reputation.
Yeah, so a penny per lookup sure looks like a pretty good deal.
Exactly. So that's the end of our presentation. We're definitely open to some questions. I saw a couple come in as we're going along. Sorry we didn't answer them in time there, but we'll take a shot at answering them now. Let me take a look here. The first one is, Jeff, how does TCPA impact Canadian or international numbers?
Well, TCPA is primarily a U.S. law, and it affects to when you're reaching out or calling into the United States, the law would apply. So if you're reaching out to Canadian numbers or international numbers, it's good to use the same best practices. You have a database, but they have different penalties and different rules. So I would probably look into which country are you looking to reach out to specifically. We do have some information on Canadian phone numbers and some real-time information on international phone numbers. I would suggest probably using the same best practices for your international prospects as well.
Makes sense. The next one is, what about text messaging from banks or credit cards for like fraud protection or something like that?
You know, there are carve-outs in the TCPA regulations that have carve-outs for fraud prevention. They have carve-outs or exemptions on money transfer notices. They also have a carve-out that allows debt collectors to reach out to your phone regardless of line type, regardless of method. They can send a text message. So there's also, I think, some carve-outs for banks to contact you when a money transfer is initiated, or when you exceeded a deposit limit, or a wire transfer has happened. So there's some really nice things to help with fraud protection in the carve-outs, which you don't have to follow and have consent when it's related to fraud protection.
Got it. That kind of leads into a next question. Who's exempt? Aside from maybe financial institutions, are there any other exemptions?
Well, you know, it's quite complicated, and don't really have a really good understanding of who exactly is exempt. But I have seen exemption rules for nonprofits. I have seen exemption rules for healthcare-related calls, where the doctor is trying to confirm your appointment in a programmatic type way. I've also seen some programmatic billing scripts in the healthcare facility. There's also time of day rules. You know, you can't call between or after 8 p.m. or before 8 a.m., things like that. So the rules for exemptions can be quite complicated. I don't really have a good understanding of them here today.
Better answered by legal. Let's see. The last one here is, how often should I check to see if a number is being reassigned or reported?
Well, you know, I think most of the cases that we're seeing today in TCPA are based around that historic phone number that's been recently reassigned, and that new person who now owns that line is complaining or has joined a class action suit or has done something malicious to force a reassignment of their port. So while some of our competitors are looking at updating the data every 15 or every 30 days, and they do it in bulk or batch, we recommend to get those assignments or determine assignment real-time, instantly, just before you call, 5 minutes before you call. Run a quick process. It only takes about a second to determine to compare that historic address with the new data. Look for differentials, look for changes. If there has been a change, you know that that number's been reassigned. So how often should I check? I'm going to say check real time every time before a contact is made.
We have clients who have programmatically put it into their call center routing where that check happens seamlessly to them, and the call never shows up in the routing that fails the check. So there are definitely ways to make it seamless and simple. So let me see, any more questions? I think we've covered them all. Some of them kind of overlap there a little bit. With that said, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We invite you to check out service objects and some of our data quality tools that we have. Happy to get on the call with you and discuss maybe your specific needs and how we can help you there. Now the TCPA is complicated, as Jeff said, it's ever evolving, and so we stay in front of that as much as possible. We do have some white papers that we invite you to download and take a look at for the TCPA, and that's about it. I think we're done.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.